The moment the boarding door closed, sealing the passengers inside, flight attendant Victoria Gray felt a sense of satisfaction. She had been doing this job for 20 years. She knew exactly how things were supposed to run: smooth, efficient, controlled. First class wasn't just a section of the plane. It was a world of order, a curated experience for those who belonged. And that's why the second she spotted him, she knew something was off. A kid, maybe 12 or 13, sitting in 3A, the kind of prime real estate reserved for corporate executives and seasoned travelers. He wasn't dressed like them, didn't carry himself like them. Hoodie, sneakers, a beat-up backpack stuffed under his seat. He looked nervous, like he didn't belong. Victoria walked straight to him, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and stopped beside his seat. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, her voice practiced, professional. "Are you lost?" The boy looked up, confused. "No, this is my seat." Victoria's lips pressed into a polite, thin smile. She had dealt with situations like this before. Economy passengers slipping into first class, hoping no one would notice. "First class is reserved for premium passengers, honey. Let me see your ticket." The boy hesitated but pulled it from his pocket and handed it to her. Victoria barely glanced at it. "Who bought this for you?" she asked, keeping her tone light but firm. "My mom," he said, gripping the armrest. Victoria exhaled through her nose. She had seen this kind of thing before. Someone had pulled some strings, maybe an upgrade, maybe a mistake in the system. Either way, this wasn't right. "I'm going to have to move you," she said, slipping into her authority like a well-worn glove. "Come on, let's find you a seat in economy where you belong." The boy's face fell. "But this is my seat." A few passengers nearby glanced up. Some looked away just as quickly, returning to their newspapers or emails. No one said anything. Victoria gave him a look, the kind that said, "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Slowly, hesitantly, the boy unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed his backpack, and stood up. His movements were stiff, controlled. His face was blank, but Victoria knew that expression well. It was the look of someone swallowing their pride. As he walked past the other first-class passengers, a weight settled in his chest. No one stopped him. No one questioned it. Victoria, satisfied that she had restored order, turned back toward the galley. She had done her job. The boy had been in the wrong place, that was all. She had no idea that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Ryan slumped into his economy seat, gripping the straps of his backpack so tightly his fingers ached. His ears burned, his stomach twisted, but he kept his face blank. He knew what had just happened. He had seen it in movies, read about it in books. He just never thought it would happen to him. The hum of the engines, the chatter of passengers settling in, the occasional rustle of a newspaper, it all blurred together. No one looked at him. No one asked if he was okay. The flight attendant who had shown him to his new seat gave a practiced, impersonal smile before moving on, already forgetting about him. His fingers trembled as he pulled out his phone. He hesitated, then typed a message. "Mom, they made me leave my seat." He stared at the screen, waiting. 3 dots appeared, then nothing. Across the ocean, Elizabeth Lawrence was sitting at a long conference table in a glass-walled office, mid-conversation with a board member, when she saw the message. At first, she didn't process it. Then slowly, the words burned into her mind. Her son moved. Her posture stiffened. The people around her noticed the shift, but no one said anything. She reached for her phone, tapped out a reply. "What do you mean? Who made you move?" Ryan's fingers flew over the screen. "A flight attendant said I didn't belong in first class." Elizabeth felt a cold, sharp anger settle in her chest. She had dealt with situations like this before, not as a mother, but as a CEO. She had built her company from the ground up. She had faced discrimination, doubt, resistance, but she had never let it stop her. And now someone had dared to do this to her son? Her next message was short. "What's the flight number?" Ryan checked his boarding pass and sent it back. He didn't know what his mom was going to do, but he knew one thing. She never let anything slide. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She turned to her assistant, James. "Get me the captain of Flight 417. Now." James blinked, caught off guard by the ice in her voice, but nodded and got to work. Back on the plane, Ryan sat stiffly, his phone gripped in his hands. He didn't know what was happening on the ground, but he knew something was coming, and he had a feeling it was going to be big. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, but inside the cockpit the air was heavy. Captain Richard Hayes adjusted his headset as the in-flight phone rang. He rarely got direct calls mid-flight. Something was wrong. He picked up. "Captain speaking?" The voice on the other end was controlled, sharp, and unmistakably powerful. Captain Hayes, this is Elizabeth Lawrence, CEO of SkyWest Airlines. I need to know why my son was removed from his first-class seat. The captain sat up straighter. He had heard that name before. Everyone in the industry had. He turned slightly, locking eyes with his co-pilot, then pressed the phone tighter to his ear. Ma'am, No excuses, she cut in. Find out now. The line went dead. Hayes didn't move for a second. Then he exhaled slowly and turned to his co-pilot. Get the lead flight attendant on the phone. Minutes later, Victoria Gray's voice crackled over the intercom. This is Gray. Miss Gray, Hayes said, his voice unreadable. Can you step into the cockpit? Victoria blinked. This was unusual. Flight attendants didn't just get called to the cockpit mid-flight. She glanced at her reflection in the galley mirror, straightened her uniform, and headed forward. When she stepped inside, the door locked behind her with a soft click. Hayes was watching her, his expression neutral but firm. Did you remove a passenger from first class? She barely hesitated. Yes, there was a mix-up. A child sitting alone in first class without supervision. Did you verify his ticket? Victoria's breath caught for a fraction of a second. I checked. I saw it, but you didn't verify it, Hayes finished for her. Silence. Hayes sighed, rubbing his temple. That boy, he said, keeping his voice steady, is Elizabeth Lawrence's son. Victoria's stomach dropped. You will personally escort him back to his original seat. You will apologize. Her mouth went dry. Captain, with all due respect, I was just following. That wasn't a request. She swallowed hard. There was no arguing now. No talking her way out of this. Without another word, she turned and stepped back into the cabin. The long walk back to economy had never felt this humiliating. Ryan sat stiffly in his economy seat, staring at the back of the headrest in front of him. The quiet buzz of the plane, the murmured conversations, the occasional clink of glasses, it all felt distant. He could still feel the weight of the moment when he had been forced to stand up and leave first class. The whispers, the glances, the way no one had said anything. His phone vibrated in his hand. Stay where you are. Don't worry about anything. His mom's message glowed on the screen, but it didn't make the tension in his chest disappear. He clenched his fingers around the device, trying to steady his breathing. He didn't know what she was doing, but he knew his mom. She never lost control. She never let things slide. A shadow fell over him. Ryan looked up, and his stomach twisted. Victoria Gray stood beside his seat, her polished appearance now slightly off, her jaw tight, her hands stiff at her sides. The confidence she carried before was gone. Mr. Lawrence, she said, her voice quieter now, more careful. There was a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat. Ryan blinked. He didn't move. A few passengers turned their heads, sensing something unusual. Even those who had ignored the situation earlier were suddenly paying attention. Victoria's lips pressed together. Your seat in first class is waiting for you. Ryan slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. The weight of the moment settled on him as he stood. It wasn't just about moving seats. It was about the fact that this flight attendant, the same one who had humiliated him minutes ago, was now being forced to undo it. As he followed her down the aisle, the cabin felt different. The same people who had watched him walk away in silence now glanced up, some with guilt, others with curiosity. But still, no one spoke. When they reached first class, Victoria stepped aside. Ryan slid back into his original seat, setting his bag down carefully. She hesitated for a second, then cleared her throat. She forced the words out. I apologize for the mistake. Ryan studied her. She didn't sound sorry. She sounded forced. He didn't say anything. He just picked up his phone and typed. I'm back in first class. Seconds later, his mom's response came. Good, sit tight. I'm handling the rest. Ryan leaned back in his seat, glancing out the window. Somehow he knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Victoria walked back to the galley with measured steps, but inside her chest was tight. The whispers followed her. She could feel the shift in the air, the silent judgment pressing down on her like a weight. The control she had carried at the beginning of this flight had slipped through her fingers, and she knew everyone on board felt it too. Lisa, the younger flight attendant, was waiting by the coffee station, arms crossed. She didn't say anything at first, just gave Victoria a long, knowing look. So, Lisa finally said, voice low, that looked uncomfortable. Victoria shot her a sharp glance. Not now, Lisa shrugged. Just saying. Never seen you walk a passenger back to first class before. Victoria ignored her, reaching for a tray of glasses. Her hands weren't as steady as they usually were. She needed to focus, to regain control of the situation. But how? The damage was done. She could feel it in the way the other flight attendants moved around her, slightly stiffer, more careful. She had been the one who gave orders, the one who set the tone. Now she was the one being watched. The intercom crackled to life. "Miss Gray, please report to the cockpit immediately." Lisa let out a low whistle. "Oof, that's definitely not good." Victoria's jaw tightened as she set the tray down and straightened her uniform. She wouldn't let herself panic. Whatever was waiting for her up there, she'd handle it. She had to. She walked through first class, avoiding Ryan's gaze as she passed. He didn't look at her either. He was scrolling through his phone, calm, collected, like he knew he had already won. Inside the cockpit, Captain Hayes sat in his chair, arms crossed. His co-pilot barely glanced at her. On the small screen of the in-flight phone, a video call was still active. And on the other end, Elizabeth Lawrence. Victoria felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Miss Gray," Hayes said, his voice steady but heavy, "you're going to explain exactly what happened." Victoria opened her mouth, but Elizabeth spoke first. "No," she said coldly. "She's going to listen." For the first time in her career, Victoria had nothing to say. Victoria swallowed, her throat dry as she stood in the cramped cockpit facing the screen where Elizabeth Lawrence's sharp gaze bore into her. There was no warmth, no hint of patience, just a quiet, unshakable authority that made Victoria feel smaller than she ever had in her career. "Tell me," Elizabeth said, her voice controlled but edged with steel. "Why did you remove my son from his seat?" Victoria forced herself to straighten her shoulders. "Mrs. Lawrence, I was following standard procedure. A child alone in first class without a guardian." "You didn't check the ticket," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice cutting through the excuse like a blade. "You didn't verify his name. You didn't follow protocol. You made an assumption." Victoria's lips parted, but she didn't speak. What could she say? It was true. She had seen a kid who didn't look like he belonged and had acted without thinking twice. Captain Hayes let out a slow exhale, watching the exchange. He had seen plenty of flight attendants make mistakes before, but this was something else. Elizabeth's voice dropped lower, each word carrying weight. "You embarrassed my son in front of the entire cabin. You made him feel out of place, and you did it without verifying a single fact." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "You thought no one would notice, didn't you?" Elizabeth continued, her expression unreadable. "You assumed it would go unchallenged, that a boy alone wouldn't fight back." I didn't mean to," Elizabeth's voice sharpened. "Intent doesn't matter, your actions do." Silence thickened in the cockpit. Victoria's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Captain Hayes finally spoke, his tone clipped. "Per corporate orders, you are to personally escort Mr. Lawrence back to his seat and issue a genuine apology." Victoria gritted her teeth. She had already done that. Wasn't that enough? "And," Elizabeth added, "when this flight lands, you will report directly to the operations office. Your conduct is under review. Security will escort you off the plane." The words hit harder than Victoria expected. Her breath caught, but she forced her face to remain neutral. "Understood?" Elizabeth asked. Victoria's hands curled into fists. There was no way out of this. "Understood," she said through gritted teeth. The call ended. Captain Hayes leaned back in his seat, watching her. "You should get back to work, Miss Gray," he said evenly. Victoria turned stiffly, stepping out of the cockpit. Every step back to the galley felt heavier, like she was walking towards something she couldn't escape. For the first time in her career, she was no longer the one in control. Victoria stepped into the galley, gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. The world felt tilted, unsteady. She had spent years building her authority, perfecting the way she carried herself so that no one questioned her decisions. Now, with a few sharp words from Elizabeth Lawrence, that authority had crumbled. Lisa stood nearby, sipping from a coffee cup. She raised an eyebrow. "That bad, huh?" Victoria shot her a glare, but it had no bite. Lisa wasn't wrong. The intercom dinged. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Victoria exhaled slowly. Less than an hour. Then this nightmare would be over, or at least that's what she told herself. In first class, Ryan sat quietly, scrolling through his phone. His mom's last message was still on the screen. "Security will be waiting at the gate. Sit tight." He glanced around. Passengers were shifting in their seats, preparing for landing, but the energy in the cabin had changed. Earlier, no one had spoken up when he was sent to the back. Now they were stealing glances at him, some with curiosity, others with guilt. A businessman across the aisle cleared his throat. Hey, he muttered. Saw what happened earlier. Ryan looked up, waiting. The man shifted uncomfortably. That was unfortunate. Ryan blinked. Unfortunate, that was the word he chose. He tilted his head. Did you think it was a misunderstanding when she made me move? The man hesitated. Well, Did you think it was a misunderstanding when no one said anything? The man's fingers tightened around his armrest. He let out a weak chuckle. Look, kid, I'm just saying. Ryan didn't break eye contact. The man sighed, looked away, and pretended to be interested in the safety pamphlet he had ignored earlier. Ryan turned back to his phone, his expression unreadable. Across the plane, Victoria checked the time. She'd been watching the minutes tick down, counting the seconds until she could get off this flight and figure out how to salvage her career. But when she looked toward the front of the aircraft, her stomach twisted. Through the small window beside the exit, she could see them. Security. Waiting. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a warning, this was the end. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, the plane slowing as it taxied toward the gate. The usual routine announcements played overhead, but for Victoria, they barely registered. She sat stiffly in the jump seat, hands clenched in her lap, staring straight ahead. She didn't dare look out the window again. She already knew what was waiting for her. Passengers began gathering their things, stretching, chatting, as if this were just another flight. But for some, it wasn't. The tension still hung in the air, thick and unspoken. People knew. They had seen what had happened. Ryan unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't rush to stand. He glanced around first, watching the small moments unfold. The businessman from earlier still avoided his gaze. A woman across the aisle hesitated, as if debating whether to say something, then didn't. Ryan exhaled. It wasn't anger he felt anymore. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was something different, something quieter. A flight attendant, not Victoria, approached him with an overly polite smile. Mr. Lawrence, would you like assistance with your bag? Ryan shook his head. I got it. The aisle slowly filled as passengers began disembarking. First class went first, as always. But Ryan waited. He wasn't in a rush. Victoria, however, had no choice. A voice crackled over the intercom. Miss Gray, please report to the front of the aircraft. She swallowed hard. Here we go. She stood, smoothing her uniform out of habit, then made her way forward, past rows of passengers who now saw her differently. Some pretended not to notice. Others wanted to look, but forced themselves not to. As she stepped off the plane, the uniformed security officers waiting at the gate turned to her. Miss Gray, one of them said, voice calm but firm. Come with us. Her stomach turned, but she nodded and followed. Behind her, Ryan finally stood, adjusting the strap of his backpack before stepping into the aisle. And then he saw her, his mom. Elizabeth Lawrence stood just past the jet bridge, arms crossed, her face unreadable. When she met his eyes, there was no anger, no frustration, just certainty, the kind of presence that made people listen. Ryan walked up to her. You okay? She asked, her voice steady. He nodded. Yeah. She studied him for a second, then gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. Good. Together, they turned toward the terminal, walking side by side. But just as they reached the exit, Ryan paused. Something in him, something new, made him glance back. Victoria was still standing near security, her expression carefully blank, but her shoulders were rigid. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring straight ahead, as if willing herself to be anywhere else. For the first time since this whole thing started, Ryan wondered something. Was she scared? Not just of losing her job, but of what came next. Of realizing that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong so many times before and had never been forced to see it. For a split second, he almost felt bad for her. Almost. Then his mom placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward, and he let it go. As they stepped into the bustling terminal, Ryan felt something he hadn't expected. Lighter. Not because justice had been served, not because someone had been punished, but because for once, when something unfair had happened, when someone tried to make him feel small, the world had noticed. And that changed everything.
This content is a work of fiction and art designed for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarities to real individuals or events are purely coincidental. Certain scenes and dialogues in the video are dramatized and contain elements of grotesque, satire, and exaggeration. The creator firmly opposes discrimination, violence, and hatred. This channel adheres to YouTube's guidelines and respects copyright laws.